She said, "Let's just be friends." Now she's watching my trips with someone who never doubted me. I guess some people don't realize what they have until they see it thriving in someone else's hands. I met Nina 14 months ago at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, where she was editing wedding photos on her laptop while I grabbed my usual morning espresso before heading downtown to my cybersecurity job. What started as a casual comment about photography turned into the kind of connection I'd been looking for without realizing it. I'd been working as a tech analyst for a downtown cybersecurity firm for 3 years, the kind of steady position that paid well enough to afford a decent one-bedroom apartment near Pike Place Market and pursue my weekend passion for rock climbing and nature photography throughout the Cascades. Nina was building her freelance wedding photography business from a shared studio space in Georgetown, specializing in outdoor ceremonies and elopements across the Pacific Northwest's most dramatic locations. Our first real conversation started when she complimented the landscape photo I used as my laptop wallpaper, a shot I'd taken during a solo camping trip to Hurricane Ridge in the Olympic Peninsula. "That composition is incredible," she said, genuinely impressed as she leaned over to get a better look. "The way you captured the morning light hitting those peaks is exactly what I try to achieve with my outdoor weddings, but clients usually want the safer shots." I showed her more photos from my climbing trips to Smith Rock and Mount Baker, and she shared her portfolio of couples exchanging vows against dramatic mountain backdrops, coastal sunsets, and alpine meadows filled with wildflowers. We discovered we both spent weekends exploring the San Juan Islands, photographing the same hidden coves and scenic overlooks from completely different perspectives. She captured human emotions against nature's grandeur, while I focused on the raw landscape itself. Nina would bring her professional gear on weekend kayaking trips to Lopez and Orcas Islands, always ready to capture spontaneous moments between couples or families, while I carried my lighter setup focused on documenting the geological formations and changing light patterns that most people missed. Our relationship developed naturally around these shared weekend adventures, establishing routines that felt both comfortable and exciting. Sunday mornings became sacred time at Pike Place Market, where we'd grab coffee and pastries before catching the ferry to Bainbridge or Vashon Island to spend entire days photographing coastal landscapes and discussing camera techniques, composition theory, and the business side of turning passion into sustainable income. Nina often joined my monthly camping trips with coworkers, documenting my rock climbing sessions for her growing adventure photography portfolio while I helped her scout locations for potential elopement shoots. We talked seriously about combining our complementary skills to pitch travel magazines on remote wilderness location features, with my technical background handling route planning, safety protocols, and equipment logistics while her artistic vision captured the human stories that made places meaningful. These weren't just casual weekend plans or hobby conversations. We were actively building something purposeful together, researching publication opportunities and developing a business plan for adventure travel photography. Nina would spend hours planning our photography expeditions with the same meticulous attention she brought to wedding shoots, researching tide schedules, weather patterns, and seasonal changes to maximize our opportunities for capturing perfect shots. I appreciated her creative ambition and professional dedication, while she valued my methodical approach to route planning, safety preparation, and the technical aspects of outdoor photography that many artistic types overlooked. Our small Capitol Hill apartment became an informal creative workspace where we'd spread topographic maps across the dining table, marking potential locations for future shoots, discussing the storytelling possibilities of different landscapes, and planning the practical aspects of building a photography business that could support both our artistic visions and financial needs. Everything started changing when Nina's ex-boyfriend Zach returned to Seattle after his wilderness survival school venture collapsed in Spokane, initially contacting Nina through social media about retrieving outdoor photography equipment he claimed to have left at her Georgetown studio space months earlier. I trusted Nina completely when she mentioned his increasingly frequent messages about gear retrieval, saying he needed his specialized macro lenses and weather-sealed camera bodies for some new project he was pursuing. "It's just business stuff," she assured me when I noticed her checking her phone more often during our usual evening walks around Green Lake. He left some expensive equipment when he moved to Spokane, and now he needs it back for whatever he's doing next. I didn't think much of it initially. Exes sometimes had practical reasons to reconnect, and Nina had always been straightforward about her past relationships. Zach began appearing at the weekend farmers market in Pike Place, where Nina sold her landscape prints and taught photography workshops to tourists and locals wanting to improve their Instagram shots, claiming these encounters were purely coincidental. While his expedition-ready Toyota Tacoma loaded with mountaineering gear, kayaks, and survival equipment became a regular sight in the market's parking area. What are the odds? Nina would laugh when describing these chance meetings, though she seemed increasingly animated when recounting their conversations about his failed business venture and his plans to rebuild something bigger and better in the outdoor adventure space. I started noticing subtle changes in Nina's behavior during our usual museum visits to the Seattle Art Museum and our planning sessions for our upcoming photography expedition to capture wildflower blooms in Olympic National Park. She seemed distracted during conversations, frequently checking her phone and sometimes excusing herself to take calls she described as client consultations or business opportunities that couldn't wait. When I suggested we finalize our travel logistics for the Olympic Peninsula trip we'd been planning for months, Nina suddenly expressed uncertainty about committing to specific dates, citing undefined scheduling conflicts and the need to remain flexible for potential last-minute photography jobs. "I just want to keep my options open," she said when I pressed for clarity about our summer plans, a phrase that felt foreign coming from someone who used to enthusiastically plan our adventures weeks in advance. The woman who once spent entire evenings researching weather patterns and tide schedules for optimal shooting conditions now seemed hesitant to commit to anything beyond the immediate weekend, claiming she needed to focus on growing her business and couldn't afford to turn down unexpected opportunities that might arise. Nina's transformation from enthusiastic planning partner to distracted and evasive became impossible to ignore as weeks passed, with her exhibiting clear signs of emotional disconnection that went far beyond normal business stress or creative restlessness that freelancers sometimes experience during challenging periods. She started showing less enthusiasm for our regular photography walks around Green Lake, where we used to spend hours discussing composition techniques, analyzing the work of photographers we admired, and scouting locations for future shoots. Instead, seeming preoccupied and checking her phone constantly for messages she'd quickly minimize whenever I glanced in her direction or tried to engage her in conversation about the beautiful scenery we were supposedly there to appreciate. Our previously exciting discussions about combining my technical skills with her artistic vision for a travel photography business began receiving lukewarm responses, with Nina suddenly claiming uncertainty about committing to long-term creative projects and expressing concerns about limiting her options by focusing too narrowly on one partnership or business model that might prevent her from pursuing other opportunities. "I just think I need to explore all possibilities before settling on any specific direction," she said when I brought up the magazine pitch we'd spent months developing, using language that felt deliberately vague and non-committal compared to her previous enthusiasm for building something meaningful together. I caught her browsing Zach's social media during what used to be our dedicated planning time on weeknight evenings, scrolling through his Instagram posts showcasing dramatic wilderness survival expeditions, ice climbing adventures in the North Cascades, and photos of him teaching survival skills to groups of outdoor enthusiasts in breathtaking remote locations across Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska that looked like scenes from adventure documentaries. The content was undeniably impressive. Zach rappelling down frozen waterfalls with professional camera equipment, leading groups through snow-covered wilderness while capturing stunning landscape photography, teaching celebrities and social media influencers survival techniques in exchange for exposure and networking opportunities that could launch bigger projects. When I walked into the room, she'd quickly switch to editing client photos or checking email, but I could see the reflective glow of adventure photography on her face that used to appear when she looked at our travel plans together, that expression of someone imagining themselves in an entirely different life situation. Nina's phone buzzed constantly with notifications she'd eagerly check, then respond to with the kind of animated typing I remembered from our early relationship when we'd text each other throughout our workdays about photography ideas, weekend adventure plans, and silly observations about office life that made us both feel connected despite being apart. The woman who used to eagerly plan our weekend kayaking expeditions to the San Juan Islands weeks in advance researching tide charts and weather forecasts with scientific precision while creating detailed shot lists for different lighting conditions, became increasingly evasive about her schedule, citing undefined studio commitments and client consultations that seemed to multiply whenever I suggested activities we used to enjoy together. Our Sunday morning routine at Pike Place Market, once sacred time for coffee and planning our weekly photography adventures while watching the fishmongers and browsing local art vendors, dissolved into rushed encounters where Nina seemed distracted and eager to cut our time short, claiming she had meetings or errands that couldn't wait until later in the day. When I suggested we finally book our Olympic National Park photography expedition for the peak wildflower season we'd been anticipating since winter, Nina expressed sudden concerns about the expense and time commitment, suggesting we might want to start with shorter day trips closer to Seattle before committing to multi-day adventures that required significant planning and resources she wasn't sure she could dedicate right now. The truth about what was really happening became crystal clear when I decided to surprise Nina with lunch at her shared photography studio in the Georgetown Arts District, thinking a spontaneous romantic gesture might help reconnect us during what I'd been assuming was just a stressful period in her business development. I arrived at the converted warehouse space around noon with takeout from her favorite Vietnamese restaurant, expecting to find her editing wedding photos or working on client consultations, but instead discovered her in an intense, animated conversation with Zach about combining wilderness survival training with adventure photography workshops in a business collaboration that clearly extended far beyond retrieving forgotten camera equipment. Nina appeared more excited and engaged than I'd seen her in months, enthusiastically discussing potential partnership opportunities while Zach described his ambitious plans to relaunch his survival school with a completely new focus on teaching photography skills during multi-day wilderness expeditions to locations across the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, and British Columbia. Their conversation flowed with the kind of creative energy and mutual enthusiasm that Nina and I used to share when planning our own photography ventures. Except now I was watching from the doorway like an outsider observing someone else's dreams taking shape. Zach's supposed quick gear pickup had clearly extended into hours of detailed planning sessions, with topographic maps of remote Washington locations spread across Nina's editing desk alongside notebooks filled with business projections, equipment lists, and marketing strategies, while his survival equipment remained completely untouched by the studio door exactly where he'd apparently left it weeks ago. I watched Nina's body language transform as she listened to Zach's stories about photographing wildlife during extreme weather conditions, scaling frozen waterfalls for the perfect shot, and teaching survival photography techniques to celebrities and social media influencers seeking authentic wilderness content for their brands and personal projects. She leaned forward with genuine fascination as he described his vision for expeditions that would combine technical survival skills with advanced photography instruction, creating unique workshops for clients willing to pay premium prices for once-in-a-lifetime experiences in locations most people never access. Think about it, Zach was saying when I finally stepped into the studio space. We could offer week-long expeditions where participants learned to survive in extreme conditions while capturing portfolio-quality images they could never get on regular photography tours or weekend workshops. The studio space where I'd always felt welcome, where Nina and I had spent countless evenings planning our own creative projects and discussing our shared vision for adventure photography, suddenly felt like I was intruding on someone else's intimate creative collaboration, especially when Zach suggested Nina could become the exclusive photographer for his relaunched survival school, traveling to Alaska, Montana, and British Columbia to document his advanced wilderness programs while building her own reputation as a specialist in extreme environment photography. Nina's eyes practically glowed as she considered the possibilities he was presenting, the chance to transform her outdoor wedding photography into something more dramatic and adventurous, with clients who valued authentic wilderness experiences over traditional romantic settings. I've always wanted to push my photography into more challenging environments, she admitted to Zach, words that stung because she'd never expressed that dissatisfaction with our careful planning and safety-focused approach to outdoor shoots. The conversation continued as if I wasn't standing there holding lunch that was getting cold, with Zach outlining his connections to adventure tourism companies, his plans for social media marketing that would attract high-paying clients, and his vision for creating content that would establish them both as leaders in the extreme adventure photography market that was apparently booming among wealthy thrill seekers and social media influencers. 2 weeks later, during our planned romantic weekend trip to photograph fall colors in the North Cascades, Nina asked me to stop at a scenic overlook near Diablo Lake and delivered what was clearly a carefully rehearsed speech about needing space to explore who she was outside our relationship and discover what she really wanted from her photography career. The timing felt deliberately chosen, surrounded by the dramatic mountain scenery we'd driven 3 hours to photograph together. She explained that seeing Zach again had awakened dormant dreams of adventure photography and wilderness exploration that she felt our safe and predictable relationship had somehow caused her to suppress or abandon in favor of comfortable routine. I've realized that I've been settling for security instead of pursuing the kind of work that actually excites me, she said, her words sounding practiced like she'd been rehearsing this conversation for days. With you, everything is so planned and methodical. We research locations for weeks, check weather reports obsessively, pack backup equipment for every possible scenario. It's responsible, but it's not the kind of photography that pushes boundaries or creates truly memorable experiences. Nina framed our stable partnership as settling for comfort rather than pursuing the dramatic, high-stakes photography career that she claimed had always been her real dream, suggesting that I deserved someone who appreciated routine and security rather than someone yearning for constant adventure and creative challenges that might involve significant risks. "You're a wonderful person, Mark, and you'll make someone very happy," she continued, using the tone people employ when delivering bad news they want to sound compassionate about. "But I need to be with someone who understands that the best photography happens when you're willing to step outside your comfort zone, to take risks that stable people might consider irresponsible or dangerous." The irony wasn't lost on me that she was breaking up with me in a location I'd researched and planned as a romantic surprise, using my own thoughtful gesture as the backdrop for explaining why thoughtfulness wasn't enough for her anymore. My calm acceptance of her decision to end our relationship clearly surprised Nina, who seemed to expect more emotional resistance, desperate attempts to negotiate or change her mind, or at least some dramatic reaction that would confirm the significance of what she was throwing away. Instead, she received a simple acknowledgement of her feelings and my immediate agreement to return to Seattle rather than continue our planned romantic weekend photographing autumn landscapes that no longer held any meaning for either of us. "That's it?" she asked when I started packing our camera equipment back into the car without argument or pleading. "You're not going to fight for us or try to convince me that we could make this work?" I looked at her standing against the mountain backdrop that would have made a beautiful portrait if we'd still been the couple who created beautiful things together, and realized that fighting for someone who had already mentally moved on would be more pathetic than dignified. "If you think our relationship has been holding you back from your dreams, then you should definitely pursue what makes you happy," I said, meaning it more than she probably expected. The 3-hour drive back to Seattle passed in uncomfortable silence, with Nina occasionally glancing at me like she was waiting for some delayed emotional response that never came, perhaps wondering if my composed reaction meant I hadn't really loved her or if it proved her point about me being too emotionally controlled for her taste. After Nina moved out of our Capitol Hill apartment within a week of our breakup, I completely withdrew from our mutual social circles and redirected my energy into long-postponed interests that I'd neglected during our relationship, enrolling in evening Japanese language classes at the University of Washington and joining a weekend volunteer group called Trail Stewards that maintained damaged hiking trails throughout the Cascade Mountains. The physical work of clearing fallen trees, rebuilding eroded sections, and installing proper drainage systems provided exactly the kind of purposeful activity I needed to process the end of my relationship while contributing something meaningful to the outdoor spaces I'd always loved. Through the Trail Stewards group, I met Autumn, an environmental lawyer who spent her weekdays fighting corporate logging interests and land development companies in court, then dedicated her weekends to hands-on conservation work that directly preserved the wilderness access she defended professionally. She was 31, with sun-streaked brown hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what she valued and why it mattered. Our relationship developed naturally through shared weekend trips to restore damaged trail systems throughout Washington's national forests, with Autumn bringing legal expertise about land preservation regulations and environmental impact assessments, while I contributed my technical problem-solving skills and photography equipment to document our conservation efforts for grant applications and public awareness campaigns. Unlike my previous relationship where I'd felt like I was constantly proving my worth or justifying my methodical approach to planning, Autumn appreciated my attention to detail and systematic thinking as essential qualities for effective conservation work that required both passion and precision. She never made me feel boring for researching weather patterns before weekend trips or packing backup equipment for every scenario. Instead, she'd add her own legal documents and emergency contact information to our planning process, treating preparation as a shared responsibility rather than evidence of being overly cautious or unadventurous. Our conversations during long days of trail work covered everything from environmental law to the philosophy of wilderness preservation, with Autumn explaining how legal precedents protected natural spaces while I shared my observations about ecosystem changes I'd documented through years of landscape photography. Meanwhile, Nina's attempts to reconnect through social media surveillance became increasingly obvious as she liked every single post I made about my trail work and conservation photography, despite supposedly being focused on building her adventure photography career with Zach and pursuing the kind of boundary-pushing work that our stable relationship had allegedly prevented her from achieving. Through mutual friends who couldn't resist sharing updates despite my requests for no information about Nina's situation, I learned that Zach's survival school relaunch had stalled due to his inability to secure proper permits and insurance for the extreme adventure workshops he'd been promising. His connections to adventure tourism companies and celebrity clients turned out to be largely fabricated exaggerations designed to impress potential business partners and romantic interests, while his social media presence showcased borrowed equipment and locations from previous employers rather than his own legitimate business operations. The Alaska expeditions and British Columbia wilderness photography workshops that had seemed so appealing during their studio planning sessions never materialized because Zach lacked the actual credentials, financial backing, and professional relationships necessary to organize legitimate adventure tourism experiences. According to the friends who felt compelled to update me despite my obvious disinterest, Nina had invested several $1,000s in specialized camera equipment for extreme weather photography, bought expensive outdoor gear for expeditions that never happened, and spent weeks creating marketing materials for a business partnership that existed primarily in Zach's imagination rather than reality. When potential clients began asking detailed questions about safety protocols, insurance coverage, and Zach's actual qualifications for leading wilderness survival expeditions, the entire venture collapsed under scrutiny that revealed most of his impressive credentials were either outdated, exaggerated, or completely fictional. Nina found herself financially invested in equipment she couldn't use, professionally associated with someone whose reputation was questionable at best, and personally involved with a man whose grand promises about adventure photography careers were apparently as unreliable as his previous business ventures that had also ended in failure and disappointed partners. 8 months after our breakup, Nina confronted me at a gallery opening featuring landscape photography from the Pacific Northwest, attempting to reconnect by confessing that her relationship with Zach had revealed itself to be built on unrealistic fantasies rather than genuine business opportunities or compatible life goals that could sustain either a professional partnership or romantic relationship. She admitted that watching my social media posts about conservation work and my developing relationship with Autumn had made her realize she'd given up something authentic and meaningful for the illusion of adventure, especially since Zach's survival school never materialized beyond impressive-sounding promises and he'd eventually moved back to living with his parents while pursuing various get-rich-quick schemes involving cryptocurrency and online marketing courses. "I made a terrible mistake," she said, approaching me near a display of mountain photography that reminded me of our failed trip to the North Cascades. "Everything Zach promised was basically fantasy. The expeditions never happened, the celebrity clients didn't exist, and I spent months planning a photography career that was never going to be real." I listened politely while she explained how Zach's inability to secure permits, insurance, or legitimate business credentials had left her professionally embarrassed and financially depleted, with expensive specialized equipment she'd purchased for expeditions that never occurred and professional connections she'd damaged by promoting workshops that couldn't be delivered. I keep seeing your posts about the trail work and conservation photography, she continued, her voice carrying the kind of regret that comes from recognizing a good decision only after making several bad ones. You're doing exactly what we talked about, meaningful outdoor work that actually makes a difference. And Autumn seems perfect for you, like she appreciates the things about you that I was too immature to value. I gently but firmly explained that while I genuinely wished her well and hoped she'd learned from the experience, I'd found authentic fulfillment with Autumn, who shared my actual values and interests rather than requiring me to constantly prove my worth through dramatic gestures or compete with fantasies about more exciting alternatives. Autumn and I work together on projects that matter to both of us, I said, meaning every word. She doesn't see my planning and preparation as boring limitations. She sees them as necessary qualities for effective conservation work. We're building something real based on shared values, not chasing some idealized version of adventure that looks good on social media but doesn't translate to sustainable happiness. 6 months later, I proposed to Autumn during a sunrise ceremony at our favorite trail restoration site in Olympic National Park, the same location where we'd spent our first weekend working together to rebuild a damaged bridge that connected 2 sections of Wilderness Trail. When I posted our engagement announcement on social media, Nina viewed it within minutes but offered no response, finally understanding that some doors close permanently once you choose to walk through different ones in pursuit of illusions that promise more excitement than the reality you're leaving behind.